Welcome. My name is Christopher Peter. The world we live in is facing many major challenges at the same time, with a hope that a new direction will help resolve many of these long-standing conflicts that has led to the resurfacing of historic divisions, resentments, and tensions that many thought might be halted through the rise of globalization. For the big story at the end of this week in the world of politics will obviously be the tension-filled exchange that occurred between President Donald Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, during an interaction that was supposed to lead to a culmination of an agreement for mineral rights to repay the United States for all the funds and weaponry provided to them in the fight against the unlawful invasion. As is the case with any story involving President Trump, there will be many media-run narratives aimed at trying to paint the president in an favorable or unfavorable perspective depending on the network you are watching or the source you are reading. But the story is bigger than how Trump is handling the situation where the United States does not have a real direct place, but has great influence. The stakes go beyond how some may want the polls to show the following week or the change in perceptions of our federal government. The focus really needs to be on how we should be addressing the major conflicts around the globe and how we can make sure that our solutions bring lasting change. Let us continue with this special episode. The United States has always been hesitant to proactively participate in global conflicts. While we played a great role in winning both world wars, America was not an early entrant to either. Europe had to fend for themselves until the United States got dragged into the conflicts, and that is the right approach. We should not be clamoring to go to war and sacrifice lives in conflict, where we really do not have any direct interests. I admire Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's patriotism, passion for his nation, resiliency in leading the fight against the Russian aggressors. I do not think anyone truly believes that Russia is the innocent party in this conflict. They illegally crossed into Ukraine's border over a decade ago and then did so once again to annex first Crimea and then the rest of the Russian-speaking territories in Ukraine. I can sympathize with his position that agreements have not worked in the past. But that does not make his demands something President Donald Trump, or any American president for that matter, should agree to. The United States should be very careful to take part in agreements where our soldiers are put in harm's way for the interests of outsiders who may recklessly cause a conflict that they cannot win. Again, not saying that is the case here, but one must assume that in the future a nation with security guarantees that commit troops from another nation may be emboldened to escalate rather than de-escalate, may not keep themselves ready for their own defense at the same time. Why should Americans bear additional risks for situations that we have not control over or influence in? That is something that Republicans and Democrats have both avoided for decades. From President Trump's perspective, he wants to end the conflict. Whether it is simply to check off another item that he did better than Joe Biden or if he simply wants to truly be the leader that ends conflicts, he is seeking to end the conflict rather than obsess over blame and forceful acknowledgement of fault. Because that is not something that will happen, especially when you consider the bigger picture. The reality that no one wants to publicly acknowledge is that Ukraine does not have a path to victory. Seems like all sides view the conflict as a stalemate at best, with Russia having the advantage across the board. They have partners able to supply them with munitions and soldiers. Ukraine is lacking manpower and has not been able to hold any gains despite using weaponry from the United States and Europe, which there are reports that Russia has adapted and overcome them. President Trump is right, despite how it may make one feel, that it does not help publicly shaming and blaming Russia or its President Vladimir Putin, because they have no real need to negotiate. They are in a perceivable advantageous position and they are probably aware that our NATO allies have not been keeping up with their commitments, which could show that their overall foes are not as prepared to help Ukraine as they might have feared early on. In any negotiation, especially a high-stake consequential one that is intended to end a war, there is a need to bring the sides to the table and influence them to see that negotiating is in their best interests rather than the status quo or pursuing other alternatives. And that is what the Trump team appears to be doing by providing reasons for Russia to negotiate rather than continuing or even escalating their onslaught. Ukraine is in a relatively dire situation, necessitating that they negotiate. They are not viewed as being able to prevail in the conflict if everything stays the same. The deck is stacked against them. While they have made an admirable stand against Russia's feared Red Army, the reality is that ongoing battles are going to be really bleak for them. For Ukraine to have any future besides the one Russia has waiting for them, they need to negotiate because there is no other choice. The Russians do not seem to care what the West says or thinks about them. Sanctions have done little to deter them because it is hard to punish economies that you do not really trade with, or ones with big enough global influence to attract partners that are not deterred from ignoring the restrictions or circumventing them. Russia does not really need to negotiate at this point if there is nothing for them to gain because they are in an advantageous position. Again, our ongoing tradition is to avoid other nations' conflicts and not get caught up in battles. Sometimes, The best policy is to not let other parties tie us up in agreements that would require American soldiers to fight the battles that we have no interests or stakes in. There still is no compelling reason for the United States to be drawn into a future conflict by other nations or even our allies, who have not really lived up to their commitments lately. Can there be lasting peace without security guarantees? But would there be lasting peace even with the security guarantees? I think we all understand why they would ask for the security guarantees. I think it is a dynamic question of whether to let a nation that is most likely to be the target of the enemy into an alliance to provide a collective defense against attacks by that enemy. Because that action alone could make attacks more likely and now create a broader conflict, which was something the alliance is also trying to deter. A big issue with the security guarantees is largely the fact that no other nation could provide a realistic deterrent besides the United States, which really questions how effective is the collective defense approach when only one nation is more than prepared and capable to provide the defense. Europe has allowed their militaries to shrink in size and ability because they operate under the construct that the United States will protect them when the Russians finally do attack. Ironically, the Europeans have grown awfully close to the Russians over time, turning to them for energy rather than their allies, relying on their natural gas and oil to heat their homes and fuel their economies instead of engaging in energy trade with the ally that they will turn to for their defense. In the bigger picture, they have really let their guard down. Like when a person gets too comfortable around a known threat and no longer views that threat as likely until it is too late. Do not get me wrong. I believe that our NATO alliance is important and should go well beyond just military. But I think some of our partners have not done enough to be good partners. Rather, they have become dependent on others to take up their share of the collective commitment. This alliance is not supposed to be just the United States protecting the world. And I think we have to ask ourselves the real question of whether these invasions in Ukraine would have happened if all NATO members actually lived up to the promises and commitments made. The purpose of NATO was having a collective defense against common enemies, which Russia and its communist dogma was the original common enemy. Each of the global powers was to contribute to the collective defense of its members, but the evidence and data show that many of our partners have been falling short on their commitments. Recent comments made by European leaders reflect that they have been. Even though they want to use the political cover of whether they can trust America, we could not trust them to do what they said they would do. All those people that worried about Trump trying to cajole our European partners during the to pony up and do what they promised to do are seeing what happens when partners fail to do their part. The collective deterrent does not work well when the closest members are no longer a real deterrent and the enemy knows they are not ready. We must remember that the nation in the membership that is attacked, hopefully that never happens, is supposed to lead or be at the forefront of the collective response. But Europe has been so generous in allowing smaller nations and those more likely to be targets into the fold, leading to a higher risk with a lower ability for that nation to play their part. And we have partners like Turkey that behave at times outside our collective interests. So the membership has gotten too big with many contributing to the harm rather than the collective defense. I do think that there needs to be a modernization of the alliance. Maybe the original members are the ones that have the full protections and the newer ones have a lower but impactful guarantee. At the very least, our European partners and North American partners need to step up their commitments and contributions. They need to be partners, not dependents, and help maintain the peace through collective strength. Build up their capabilities and raise their defense spending to what they promised, not simply hiding behind the stars and stripes. There are people who obsess over the optics rather than the substance. That is largely the product of the social media influence where people focus on what is immediately in sight rather than the whole context of the bigger picture. At times, people want to see things completely compartmentalize the snapshot as one thing or the other without context or truth. For instance, I saw a person on social media state that Ukraine should be able to negotiate the terms and the United States should back that, and the poster was clearly unable to define what back that would look like. The thread was more than a person going back and forth with the Twitterverse. It reflected that people do not really understand what security guarantees really would entail. For those people wanting to stand with Ukraine or march against our policy, the more effective thing to do if you completely support their cause and the status quo is to sign up and join their fight because they could surely use the bodies. But these people will not do that, nor should they, because the proper path forward is to stop subsidizing this and push for peace. Some people echoed a thread that if you stand with Israel, you should stand with Ukraine, and vice versa, which is true. The major differences between the two that you should not confuse is that Israel is able to prevail in their conflict with minimal support and that they have an end in mind that is rational, achievable, and almost there. The perception that if you do not give Ukraine exactly what it asks for without question that you are propping up or supporting Putin is a petulant stance. There is reason to ensure that aid being provided is contributing to an outcome. Can that outcome be achieved, and what is the party receiving the aid doing to maximize the impact in an efficient and effective manner? I support the Ukrainian effort and admire their fight. At the same time, I think you need to weigh the whole situation and project ahead. Are they winning this fight currently? It certainly does not appear so. Can they win this fight? Based on their troop levels and changes on the Russian side, it appears that the deck is stacked against Ukraine. They lack available troops and almost completely rely on foreign aid. Without foreign fighters, they do not appear positioned to prevail. The projections regarding the future of this conflict do not seem to be positive in the minds of anyone. That is why it is important that the world comes to the decision that this conflict needs to end. I do think it is a positive that we are seeing the Europeans take a greater stand and responsibility, which is something that needed to happen. I agree that Europe has to be the center of the solution because they are closest to the threat. We should support NATO, Ukraine, Israel, and those who align with our interests. But we cannot be coerced into bad public policy that increases risks on the United States while retaining the benefits elsewhere. We need a stronger NATO and should value our allies. But that requires all our allies agreeing to help and not just look to the United States to carry the load and the burden while they sit back in luxury. We must stop looking at every issue as to how it makes a political leader we support or oppose appear and what the actual policy approach should be. At the beginning, the right approach was to provide aid and see if Ukraine could fight to push back Russian aggression. For quite some time, the facts, evidence, and data showed that they could not. The transition towards a peace negotiation should have been how our policy in this regard evolved. Just like it did with the conflict in the Middle East, where it became clearer that Israel was achieving its objectives and a ceasefire was more appropriate, as long as the hostages were returned. Accepting the reality does not make you a puppet to Putin or anti-Ukraine. Understanding the reality that there is a point where the best path is the preservation of what remains and stopping the continual loss of life is what matters most. For all those referencing the World Wars and the Cold War, they should remember the initial approach was containment, which worked better for the latter one in its later stages. In this case, stopping the loss of life in the fighting then allowing for the rebuilding of the Ukrainian defense and maximizing concessions is the best decision at the moment. Our allies hopefully will wake up and not separate from each other, which we should not leave them either. But we need to accept that each member bears a responsibility and commitment to the collective defense. One nation followed through on that commitment. The rest really have not done as much as they could. A big thank you to the audience for experiencing this podcast. The failed signing event was not optimal, but I do think Trump and Vance were on the right side of the argument. The United States has done a great deal to support their war efforts and we keep getting asked for more without any accountability of the money spent, how the war is being fought, and what will be done differently. The numbers show that America has done more than Europe combined. So, there is no question about whose side America has stood with. I think the rational position is with Trump to focus on ending the conflict and saving lives. A deal needs to be done. Zelensky is understandably emotional. The Christopher Peter Review, your source for an economic perspective on salient current events. Please continue to visit the Christopher Peter Review at www.crcreview.com for more, or subscribe on YouTube. Thank you again and talk to you next time.